Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hey, Chris just went in the back there like a big fucking rock star.
No, wait a minute. We didn't properly coordinate beforehand. I thought walking onto a stage when the theme music finishes might get a round of applause. Now I just look like I think this is all about me.
Truly, this podcast is all about you, Chris, anyway, so it's good to go.
Okay, so setting up for the show tonight was absolutely smooth as you could hope for.
Yeah, it was the smoothest thing I've ever done in my life.
Absolutely perfect. So we're all extremely calm and everything's working perfectly.
And I'm not hungover at all.
I'm freaking out, man. I'm not gonna lie. I'm fucking freaking out here.
At least the last time there was only like 5 people here. Now there's actually human beings here, so we better make it good.
Victims of our own success.
Fuck.
Do you want to start it off properly then?
No. So this is a podcast. This is going to be edited later on. It's probably going to be impossible to cut out your heckles. You can contribute heckles as long as they're well considered and funny. Prefer if they're not funnier than us. So we're Mark, you might as well introduce this because this is your fucking choice.
So thank you everybody for coming. I know Chris didn't say that, but thanks for coming. And this is the Pop Punk Mixtape. It's 100th episode. I can't believe I've been sitting in a room with these two fuckers for 100 fucking episodes. It's taking years off my life.
I definitely didn't expect to mark it in this fashion.
Yeah, but yeah, so thank you again. Thank you for coming. We're going to talk about this much maligned genre, which was very much my upbringing in music, I suppose you could say.
I think I've contributed at least 50% of that maligning.
When we talk about your suggestion, we can definitely unpack that. But we did grunge last one. We're doing pop punk this one. We've already done Dave's black metal one, but I'm sure he's got something.
And Dave's new metal one. That's not
Dave's
free.
I'm 2 up, aren't I? So I've got a lot of payback due.
Yeah. I'd like to also forward the caveat. I'm sorry about my voice. It's a little bit off. I've been really, really ill all week. Coincidentally, the more I studied pop punk, the sicker I got. To the point where I couldn't leave my bed, which is around about the time we got to about 1999, 2000, and Blink-182 were kind of at their peak. So, yeah, that's not a coincidence.
So how this is going to go, we're going to give you a bit of a history on pop punk, and then after that we're going to pick 3 records. There'll be an intermission in between both parts where Kyle, Lovers Turning Monsters, is going to play some pop punk songs on his ukulele. Can we please cheer for that? Woo! Thank you. It's going to be a fucking lovely night. Shall we begin, gentlemen?
Yeah, also, there is going to be an opportunity to ask some questions before we do the Nexus. We've done a Nexus, which was suggested by somebody who won it in the competition. And we'll give you a chance to ask some questions before that. So if there's anything we don't cover, anything we say that you think is factually inaccurate or morally objectionable, then you can raise that then. And if you just want to bam us up, you can raise that then as well, because this is the only time where this gets to be a two-way process. So we're going to kind of break down the history and we'll fly through it a little bit. We'll take some areas. I mercifully was able to take the early years when it was still too young to do any real damage. And I'm going to start with that. Now obviously, I don't want to exhaustively kind of chart the origins of guitar music and punk music and electricity.
Yes, you do. You do that every fucking week.
Yeah, and opposable thumbs. Basically, big names in the early history of punk music were the Stooges and the MC5. There was also a Detroit act called Death from about 1971. Who are really worth looking into because they're totally overlooked, and there's something that hopefully one day we get to cover in a bit more detail. And actually there's also a Peruvian act of all things called Los Psychos, who were I think even earlier than that, and who really don't look like a punk band, but when you hear them it's pretty amazing what they were doing with absolutely no influences to pull from. But these kind of acts, I think, are kind of commonly called proto-punk now. Anyway, they were sort of succeeded. in this kind of first phase of specifically pop punk, the years will include stuff like 1977 you had bands like Vibrators, 78 you had Radiators from Space, and the Adverts. The Adverts were kind of one of the first bands to lean really heavily on the bored teenagers kind of aspect of the lyrics. '79 you had the Buzzcocks, '80 and '81 you had the Undertones, although those acts, and maybe even Radiators from Space as well, they've got more in keeping with what went on to become New Wave, I think, and we'll mention that. Then from like 83, 84, 85, you've got the Dickies released a song called Rosemary. '84, Mr. T Experience had a song called Disconnection. '85, The Descendants, obviously The Descendants, who we've covered at length in the show before, and I think the sound of those bands is more commonly what all of us consider pop punk, certainly what I consider pop punk. But in terms of like the really early touchstones, the two that really jump out in '76 in the USA, you had the Ramones, and when the Ramones released their self-titled record, it's the record with like Blitzkrieg Bop, it's the record with Judy is a Punk. And obviously, I mean, with any kind of label debate's always going to rage, but this is kind of seen as maybe the first punk release, the first punk rock release. What's really telling, especially towards, it's not really a case we're building, but in terms of trying to narrow down what we're talking about, the Ramones loved Motown. The Ramones loved 60s pop music in particular. They loved the Supremes, they loved the Ronettes, they loved the Beach Boys. They covered a lot of songs, covered Let's Dance, they covered I Wanna Be Your Boyfriend, they covered Needles and Pins. And they also really loved like bubblegum pop at the time, like the Bay City Rollers, and actually the similarities are pretty striking. So as part of our little visual aid here, which people just listening to the online version won't get, we've got a wee clip here to try and show you the similarities between the Ramones and the Bay City Rollers, which is not something you'll hear very often.
You know, the Bay City Rollers famously hate each other now, and they bam each other up before they go on stage.
Yeah, I believe I told you that.
Yeah.
So one of the guys that works in the printing shop round the corner for where I work and from where David works, he does like tour management for bands that are sort of past it, which is a pretty grim job, but he's a pretty grim guy, so it kind of suits him. And he was saying that the Bay City Rollers really pretty much hate the sight of each other now. For example, when they're at shows, there was one show recently where it's all kind of like ladies in their 50s and 60s sort of throwing their bloomers kind of thing, and the band went to go on stage for an encore, and basically the singer said, do I have time to go to the toilet? And they were like, yeah, go for it. And as soon as he left the room, they all went on stage and stood on stage for like 3 minutes looking at their watches, shaking their heads. So the audience started booing and stuff. And then this singer runs out on stage, still like doing up his fly. And this was just a constant thing of them trying to catch each other out. But not in a kind of like, hey, Jape's on tour kind of way, but in a kind of, fucking hate being around you guys, but this is the only way I can make money these days.
But anyway, that's going to come up again later on as well. That's not the first time this chat's going to happen in the course of this podcast.
All right, so these two tracks are very similar. So basically, Joey Ramone was actually quoted as saying that "Hey ho, let's go," that whole phrase was lifted almost directly from Basic Rollers. In his words, "Blitzkrieg Bop was our Saturday night." So that was happening in the States at that time. And then meanwhile in the UK, the same year, a few months later, you had The Damned, and The Damned with what was ostensibly the first punk single in New Rose. Again, people will disagree about that, but
it's kind of strange, like a story, see. I don't know why. I guess these things have gotta be. I've got a new rose, I've got a good. Yes, I knew that I always would.
Is not about politics, it's about girls. It's about a girl, which kind of set the tone for a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about later, because I think punk's associated, especially for me, my favourite punk's associated with quite political themes, but in the case of pop punk, it very rarely is associated with politics, and when people do touch on politics, it can kind of scupper it a wee bit. So New Rose was about a girl, not about politics. Meanwhile, New Rose also references the opening line of the Shangri-La's song "Leader of the Pack," where there's the kind of little dialogue at the start, which is like,
"Is she really going out with him?
Is she really going out with him? Well, there she is. Let's ask her. Betty, is that Jimmy's ring you're wearing? Mm-hmm.
And that's the opening part of New Rose as well. So again, they were kind of making a nod to the 60s pop scene, and even though they were a response to it, they really liked it as well. It's a melodic song, very tuneful. The B-side to New Rose is also a cover of Help by the Beatles, albeit quite a warped cover of Help, but a cover of Help. And I think it's also worth mentioning as well, in terms of drawing the connections between these early punk bands and pop music of the time, that The Damned, the bands like the Cramps, Sex Pistols, and I think even just your kind of mental image of punk rockers, really, really heavy mascara, like whited out faces, all kinds of things like that. That owes a lot to Mark Bolan, it owes a lot to David Bowie, it owes a lot to the acts like that at the time. So, I think what I'm trying to say is from early on in punk music, like the pop punk tie-in wasn't exclusively like a later development. It was actually something that was really, really present from the start. At times ironically, but at times like really unironically. In 1977 you had the Buzzcocks, one of the earliest kind of combinations of speed, melody and sort of angst. Their first single actually, which is one that I'd say most people probably haven't heard, is a track called Orgasm Addict.
That sticks on your orgasm addict. Sneaking in the back door with dirty magazines. So your mother wants to know what all the stains on the jeans. And you're an orgasm addict. You're an orgasm addict.
Predictably about masturbation, there's a line in it, it's a labour of love, fucking yourself to death, and I think again that's an early example of some of the kind of more puerile humour that would appear in what would distinguish pop punk from more earnest punk. What would set No Effects apart from Bad Religion, this kind of thing. And it's also something that the likes of Green Day, Longview, their first like really big video, owed a lot to that kind of like silliness, really. 1977 you had Generation X, Gen X, featuring Billy Idol. And at the time they were kind of dubbed plastic punk by the punk community. They were seen as like fakes and cash-ins. So punk was still really about legitimacy at that point, and even though some of the things were quite playful, it was about being a real punk act, and Gen X were sort of seen as being quite contrived. And I think even though they weren't always taken seriously, first of all, the Gen X album now it holds up pretty well as a record. It's a really good album, but it's also in its own way a big breakout success. It's the first time that teeny boppers really could access that music, because punk was quite threatening, it was quite intimidating, it was the stuff their parents told them to stay away from. And then as you can see, Gen X were on top of the pops, a dozen times, something like this. So they were a bridge to this mainstream audience that hadn't really existed thanks to, you know, the Sex Pistols, Potty Mouths and the Clash's politics and things like that. In 78, you had the Undertones, Teenage Kicks. I think it's a reference to the MC5 Teenage Lust, but it basically sounds like T-Rex sped up. And while the Undertones were quite involved in teenage sort of issues and angst and romance and these kind of things, their Irish contemporaries, bands like Stiff Little Fingers, for example, were at the time singing about politics. They had a track called Alternative Ulster. Even though it was really about being bored, it was about being bored against the backdrop of the Troubles, and a lot of their stuff was a lot more politically themed. So the Undertones, as famous as they were for that, were still quite consistent with this later idea of punk as being quite light-hearted. And I mean, by about 1982, you had bands like The Clash playing Stadia. And also at that time, you had bands like Blondie, Elvis Costello, The Police, The Go-Go's, all these new wave acts, especially in the States, kind of branching off. And they were more citing the Buzzcocks and the Undertones. Meanwhile, like back in 78, over in the States, in California, something was really starting to happen. You had the Dickies, who were a huge early innovator, really, really key, played super, super fast. In fact, apparently watching the Dickies play fast was originally what made Bad Brains speed up. And for those of you that are familiar with Bad Brains had a massive influence on both the New York scene and the Washington DC scene. And so by proxy, the Dickies did help create this much more extreme form of music, even though they're taking it. Their debut album, The Incredible Shrinking Dickies, was dubbed easy listening punk, and it was fast and intense, but it was really silly. Also, I think it's an interesting aside that the Dickies did a cover of the Banana Splits theme, which you may well have heard. And around about that, well, shortly after, the Toy Dolls covered Nella the Elephant. A couple of years later, the Vandals covered Summer Lovin' from Greece. And that all set the scene for this referencing of pop in the format of punk. And not even just pop, but like fun, childish, TV shows and things like that. It kind of paved the way for Me First and the Gimme Gimmes as well, in a big way.
Who put the bop in the bump, a bump, a bump? Who put the ram in the ram, a lam, a ding dong? Who put the bop in the bop, a bop, a bop? Who put the dip in the dip, 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 dip? Who was that man? I'd like to shake his hand. He made my baby fall in love with me.
It became synonymous with these bands that they could do those songs for a laugh. I think in the early kind of US movement as well, between about 79 and 82, Orange County, there was a lot happening there. The Adolescents had recorded a track called Amoeba in 81.
Scientists in our lab, looking through the microscope. The little glass sides, they never lie. How can this fall like...
Which is a good example of kind of hardcore and tunefulness kind of combining. Largely, I think, thanks to a guy called Rick Agnew, who played guitar for them. And Rick Agnew was really ahead of his time in terms of his ability and what he was doing with it. 1980, the band called Agent Orange released a song called Bloodstains. It was quite a big breakout hit, got a bit of student play, although they actually later sued The Offspring for, in their opinion, stealing the guitar solo in the middle, the kind of Dick Dale style surf rock guitar solo for the track Come Out and Play. In 82, Social Distortion, Mommy's Little Monster. Mike Ness's voice set the scene for bands like Jawbreaker and Rancid, and then eventually bands like Hot Water Music, who we spoke about in a previous show. But they in their own way took elements of the hardcore scene and made it a bit more mainstream accessible and more radio friendly. So there was like a convergence happening from all angles here. In 82, the Descendants brought out Milo Goes to College, which was much more accessible than the bands they were touring with, bands like Black Flag. And it was a big breakthrough in combining styles, and it was also a huge moment in terms of signifying that punk bands don't have to sing about Reagan in order to, entertain. And then I think the last thing I'll really mention before I hand over to Mark is that from about 1982 to 1987, two bands that had a big influence in their own way, but they were kind of out the road from Minnesota, which was kind of off the grid for the punk scene at the time, The Replacements and Husker Du. They were a big sonic shift, and they were maybe closer in sound to the kind of new wave progenitors like the Buzzcocks. And by the second record of both bands, they were getting radio play, Hootenanny by The Replacements and Zen Arcade by Husker Du. And both eventually went on to sign to majors, but their taking it played a big part in some of the more rock-based structures that happened later, because they set the scene for alt-rock whilst from a punk basis. Now we've got a wee clip.
Okay, I'll crack on then. So Chris had mentioned Descendants, who were a band that formed in the time of punk. They formed in 1977. Bill Stevenson described their sound as being a coffeed out blend of surf rock and pop punk music, and I think that's pretty accurate. So from going from like bands like the Ramones and the Damned to bands like the Descendants and and Bad Religion, it's not quite a straight line, but I think it's pretty damn close. Bands that were moved around that scene, so bands like Bad Religion and Descendants in particular, they were also hanging out with hardcore punk bands like Minor Threat and Youth of Today and stuff like that. You can kind of see, well, if you think about punk music in that time, it kind of goes two directions, right? It either goes to being like proper hardcore, which is stuff that would then go on and influence bands like Hatebreed and... Throwdown and stuff like that, and then you've got pop punk. So because all the people that we're going to talk about when it comes to the golden age, the 1990s, they were all hugely influenced by Bad Religion and Descendants.
It's really weird if you watch some of the old videos to see the Descendants and Black Flag touring together, kind of prime, shredded, angry Henry Rollins, like shirtless, like raging against the universe, and the Descendants singing about coffee and farts.
So you can see where the pop punk thing comes from for Descendants. This is a clip of Bikeage from Milo Goes to College. Next, after that, is also a video of Bad Religion, the song You on No Control.
There's a place where everyone can be right, even though you remain determined to be opposed. And critics Glasgow qualifications. It's where everyone has been and where everybody goes. So
but there's so many songs you could pick from Bad Religion that they use the very specific harmonic kind of thing that the bands that influenced the Ramones did, the kind of Phil Spector era kind of doo-wop stuff.
Yeah.
They do quite a lot of that.
Something that's really interesting about Bad Religion, though, I mean, I'm assuming you're going to mention Suffer in some detail, but for anyone that knows Bad Religion, they had How Could Hell Be Any Worse, this kind of first album that was full-on punk. Then they just committed like punk suicide with a record called Into the Unknown.
It's not even on Spotify. It's not even on Spotify. That's how bad it is.
Notorious. It's so bizarre. Like, they became this weird 80s synth band for one record and died on their arse and vanished out of sheer shame, I think. And it was only after they came back that they really started to really make big waves. But Bad Religion themselves cited, despite the fact that they had a lot of really, really strong political content their whole career, it was bands like The Jam, Elvis Costello and the Ramones that were the biggest musical influences on them.
Yeah, definitely, and that is a huge thing.
I
And
could probably sing Bad Religion.
I could no, I'm not going to do that. You can do it though. You're a huge Bad Religion fan.
I could masturbate in a computer screen the way that Greg Graffin did. I don't think I could sing the songs.
So another band that were brought up kind of mostly around about that time, and Chris has mentioned them as well, was Social Distortion. Mummy's Little Monster was obviously their first album, but it's not quite. It's very, very gruff, but you can tell that Mike Ness, who's a singer at Social Distortion, he had a huge love of 50s rockabilly music, and you can hear that on later records in particular. Operation Ivy, I want to talk about Operation Ivy, who were a huge influence on a lot of punk bands. They were a kind of punk, hardcore, ska crossover band. They did one album.
No defense, you call that a new way of thinking. I call it regressive to ignorance. Take warning, take warning. Take warning.
And famously it contained Tim from Rancid, who Rancid would then later go on to be one of the foundational acts, and I'm sure Dave will talk about that in a minute.
Just a heads up as well, right? For anyone that feels like me, Operation Ivy basically helped create ska punk. So you know where to send the fucking bombs, all right? Because those absolute dicks set the scene for, I mean, it's all number of monstrosities like Sublime, No Doubt, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Less Than Jake.
Real Big Fish.
Absolute fucking ghastly shit.
I'm no lover of ska punk either, and to be honest, in terms of Operation Ivy, I can take or leave them because of the huge ska punk element, but it's kind of cool though, because they were obviously listening to things like The Clash, who'd brought in, like, you know, reggae and stuff like that into punk music in two-tone, and then they took it to the next level, and then obviously they split up and they all went their separate ways, and Tim went on to form Rancid, who turned out to be a huge influence. But bands in the late 80s and early 90s, they were taking like the hardcore punk and merging it with like various different pop things. So you can think about other bands. I'm going to rattle off some names. You got bands like the Queers, Screeching Weasel. You've mentioned Jawbreaker. Jawbreaker were also a massive sort of, it's really difficult to think about how big their influence is, given how small a band they are compared to a lot of their contemporaries. Their album 24 Hour Revenge Therapy came out in 1994, which was the same year as things like, you know, Dookie and Smash and all that, but it was nowhere near as well known.
6 a.m., the floor comes alive with lice. The pants dry up so tight. With hot and bass, we're hungry.
Are you going to spend much time on Lookout?
On Lookout? I wasn't going to talk too much about Lookout.
Well, basically,
but it's a good time to jump in.
Yeah, from about 1987. This is the Lookout's first release was Operation Ivy, and Lookout ended up. I mean, I guess, and for some people, there's like I've seen it written that there were basically like 4 schools of punk at this time. So you had like skate punk, like sort of Epitaph, Fat Wreck, Pennywise, No Effects, Face to Face, that kind of stuff. This is like as of the early 90s. You had the kind of Ramones core stuff that Mark's talking about, which is sort of Screeching Weasel, the Queers, a band called Vindictives.
And now I just don't care what's going on outside this room. Things are getting better, my future's not so bright. Fuck the world, I'm hanging out with you tonight. Whoa.
And all those bands actually released entire albums, the Ramones covers as well, as if to underline just how fucking derivative they were. You had Lookout style punk, which eventually became Green Day, but it was stuff like Jawbreaker, J Church. This was in about San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of that had big ska elements, including Operation Ivy, as I mentioned, who went on to influence far too many fucking idiots. And Cruise Records is another one. Descendants All Drill Car, who were actually a little bit more innovative, especially bands like All, who could be a little bit more interesting in their arrangements and stuff. I think like Screeching Weasel are pretty significant in the minds of a lot of people that are into punk. Unfortunately, they're also pretty notorious now for reasons they'd probably rather forget. But like their second record sort of set a template for a lot of pop punk sounds. The themes are really reminiscent of Blink-182. They had a couple of landmark releases early on, like tracks called Science or Myth and My Brain Hurts. But ultimately, I mean, it kind of ended quite ignominiously for them, because the singer, basically the whole band quit the singer after the singer assaulted 2 women during a South by Southwest show in the crowd, who were throwing ice cubes at him.
I mean, speaking of the Tory stickheads, there's also another big band that were influential in this kind of music is a band called Guttermouth as well. And Scott Adkins is well known for being one of those guys that just likes to be like anti everything and hate everything. But he on Warped Tour a few times he's said the wrong things, like sort of transphobic, misogynistic, a lot of shit like that. But their sound is also a huge influence on stuff like that. And it's interesting that you mentioned skate punk as well, because I have a skate punk bonus round.
Okay.
So it kind of diverges in the early 90s. It diverges. So bands take stuff from Bad Religion and then they go faster. NoFX being a good example of that. Because they were always really sloppy and really fast, and the whole shtick was like, we're not really that good, but we just fucking write songs and just play it everywhere. So it's like taking like the harder edged element of what was like Bad Religion and stuff and making it faster. And then
can I just, you're talking about NoFX, like from, I mentioned Epitaph sort of stuff, that's, I'm guessing you've got a fair bit to say about Epitaph, or?
Only when it comes to the suggestions of the albums.
Right, okay, well, fair enough. So Epitaph, Brett Gurewitz, because he was a massive heroin habit, bankrupted the whole thing. And Epitaph started again and really started to make a bit of an impression in '86. They became quite a big influence in the scene. They went on to be an even bigger influence in the scene, I think, via things like the Punkorama compilations, which I'm sure, even if you don't like this music, and believe me, I do not like this fucking music, but I've seen those CDs everywhere. Much like I've seen the drive-through records, DVDs everywhere as well. Like every charity shop in Glasgow was held together by those for a while. But that label went on to, Epitaph at the time went on to release NoFX, who Mark's just played, especially around about that kind of harder era. It released L7, it released Pennywise, who I always get a row for mentioning too much in this show, but at least today I've got an excuse. Rancid and Offspring. So it was really, really significant. And actually Fat Mike from NoFX said that the Bad Religion album Suffer, where the band actually came back into good favour, saved NoFX as a band. He was roadieing at the time, I believe, and he was about to split up NoFX because it wasn't really going anywhere. And he said he heard Suffer, and in his own words, it's the best thing I ever heard. It was a perfect line between pop and hardcore. As a huge Bad Religion fan, I kind of agree with that. The fact that Bad Religion helped NoFX stay together.
I mean, Fat Mike is now a multi-millionaire because of that. So
there is no justice.
Yeah, there is no justice. Other bands that were skate punk bands, they would kind of take influence from bands like Suicidal Tendencies, who were hardcore bands but really fast. Institutionalized, obviously, been a huge song which most people will have heard. If not, you should go and look it up just for historical accuracy, if for nothing else.
They just keep bugging me. They just keep bugging me. There's bills on the side. It's gotta be a good life. So come and pray with my life. You will have anything. I'm pray what you can see away. I'm not crazy. Here's the design. You're the one that's crazy.
And then other bands that started in the 90s, early 90s, that were skate punk bands like Lagwagon, Good Riddance, Strung Out, who just basically push the speed. They just go faster and heavier and harder.
I think a band that will probably slip under the radar of most of our conversations, because they slipped under the radar of most people's lives. It was a group called the Dead Milkmen.
One Saturday I took a walk to Zipperhead. I met a girl there and she almost knocked me dead. Oh God, girl, please look me. Let's travel around the world, just you.
Kenny, you've heard the Dead Milkmen? All right, Mr. Kenny Benella, prime contributor, is the only guy old enough to have heard the Dead Milkmen. And they had actually a really, really big single called Punk Rock Girl. And Punk Rock Girl, I think, was technically the first punk rock song to ever get played in MTV. It was in '88, and it was when MTV was obviously becoming like hugely influential. It already was quite influential, but it was kind of approaching its peak. The band didn't really break overall, but that one breakout song really kind of blew open the doors for people to follow. It's basically like a punkier version of They Might Be Giants, but it is definitely punk rock, and it sounds like an early version of pop punk. So this band, the Dead Milkmen, as anonymous as they are now, yeah, they had a big part in making punk an option for programmers. And honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that punk could get rammed down your throats in MTV, it would never have got where it got in the end, like most genres, to be fair.
So before I hand over to Dave, there's two things that I'll mention in terms of pop punk. Some skate punk bands would then go on to influence some of the bands in the classic era of pop punk, like The Offspring, who ostensibly were a skate punk band when they started. Some skate punk bands then became pop punk bands, like No Use for a Name. Tony Sly, I think, is one of the best punk songwriters, certainly of like the past 20 years, 30 years probably, given how old the band are, or were. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but they were huge, like, he's a huge pop songwriter underneath it all, and he started shedding that and doing more. I could talk about them for ages. We could do a whole episode on them, but it's not about that. And then bands like Green Day and stuff, who were never quite skate punk, but you could tell they all came from Gilman Street. They came from SoCal, and a lot of the nexus of pop punk comes from the West Coast. It comes from not just particularly SoCal itself, but that sound influences a lot of pop punk bands as well. Even bands that are not from the Southern California take huge influence from that. Obviously, Offspring and Green Day being two of the biggest ones because they all came out of that era. And that's,
I don't want to like assume too much, because I certainly wouldn't have known it until I started reading out about this. But Mark just mentioned Gilman Street. So Lookout Records, which was based in California, was founded by a guy called Larry Livermore. He actually named it after his old band, The Lookouts. And it was kind of based around this place called 924 Gilman Street, which was a kind of not-for-profit collective and venue. And that's where so many of that early group of bands started and met and came together. As we said, Operation Ivy were very big in that scene. But also in '86, there was a band called Sweet Children who formed from the audience in there, and they would later go on to become Green Day. And a lot of the sounds from that era play a massive, massive part in the catalogues of everybody that we've mentioned already, on into bands like Bowling for Soup, things like that. So I mean, that there were these kind of key I think back then it was actually quite, as much as I don't particularly like what came out at Lookout Records, most of it, I do love the early Green Day stuff, I love it, but the rest of it I can totally do without. But it's nice that a hub like that, like a physical hub, was such a productive and important catalyst for this worldwide phenomenon. I think before Dave picks up as well, there's probably a few other points that are worth touching on, because I think obviously, look at the way I'm dressed, for fuck's sake. 1991, Nirvana happened, and my wardrobe forever changed.
Forever remained the same, depending who you ask.
Yeah. And I think Nirvana considered themselves as a punk rock band, even though they sounded very different. We actually spoke about this in the Grunge Mixtape. A lot of the best grunge bands, Melvins, Nirvana, considered themselves punk bands. And they changed the makeup of the record industry, certainly, in the US and abroad, and all these alternative sounds started to get snapped up. They cracked open MTV. I mean, I mentioned the Dead Milkmen, but Nirvana really cracked open MTV to all these alternative bands. I mean, and you know, 1991 is not known as the year punk broke necessarily for pejorative reasons, even though that's maybe why Sonic Youth used it. The Teen Spirit video, for example, looks like a punk rock show. There's an Offspring video from the Smash album that looks almost identical, albeit with added white guy cornrows, which is a nice touch. Even like bands like Bad Religion and Offspring, they really got major deals on the back of Nirvana breaking the way they did. Because, I mean, obviously that happened for like Jawbox, it happened for Helmet, it happened for any number of really cool, interesting alternative bands, but it also bled into these kind of the fringes of this punk movement that were happening at the time. So they played a big part in that sense. I mean, see NoFX and Fat Wreck. So that was like round about 1992 that became like a big deal, right? It seems to me, as a kind of casual observer, that they are hugely pivotal in the history of it. No?
Yeah, I mean, Fat Wreck are still a huge thing. I mean, there's the fact, like Epitaph had its sound, Fat Wreck has got a sound, it's still got a very particular sound. The bands that are on it now, they don't sound like anything like NoFX, but they all sound quite similar to each other in a lot of ways. And one of the only things I like about Fat Mike is the fact that he's managed to keep that just completely independent. Epitaph has got a massive distribution deal with Sony Records. Fat Wreck don't have anything like that, and he's a multi-millionaire because of being a punk. Like, how is that even, there's videos of him online, like, playing golf and taking his fucking kid to his private school, like, dressed fucking full mohawk and, like, just, like, it's just really weird, man. But that's the only thing I really admire about Fat Mike is that. I think I can pretty much take or leave the guy and most of his music, to be fair, but Fat Wreck was a huge deal, kind of still is a huge deal. I know a lot of bands, like, still want to get signed to Fat Wreck. I also know some bands, some I know personally, who couldn't wait to get off Fat Wreck because it's like a ceiling as well. Like, you can only get so far, and then after that if you want to go further, you need to move to a bigger label. So it's still kind of in the middle. But yeah, a huge influence.
So, I mean, NoFX and Fat Wreck have a huge part to play in the sort of mainstreaming of that, like, gross comedy thing as well, right? The humour element.
NoFX particularly, yeah. Not a lot of Fat Wreck bands, like, have that vibe to them, that kind of same puerile kind of thing.
Yeah, so it was something that the Vandals had started to move into, and later in their career they started to get a bit more smutty and silly and inane, but NoFX seemed to really pick up on that and took that kind of Bad Religion-y musicianship and kind of gravitated towards that much lighter, sillier lyricism.
Not all the time. I mean,
not
NoFX are at their best when they're being serious. And whether they're writing songs which are criticising, like, the punk rock scene or major labels or being political.
NoFX are at their best when they're switched off. But they also, was it NoFX or was it a Fat Wreck band that really took that sound of Operation Ivy and sort of started adding trumpets and that? Where did that come from?
That's Rancid. It comes from And Out Come the Wolves mostly. That's where that comes from, which was on Epitaph. Also, Less Than Jake started in the late 80s as well.
That's, I was going to mention. I was going to mention like bands like Lagwagon as well.
Lagwagon were never like.
No, not so much. Yeah. I don't mean in terms of the ska, but in terms of like the names that started to bubble up from that label and that side of the scene. Propaganda's early stuff.
Propaganda.
Good riddance as well. Is that right?
Yeah. Strung Out, who I also mentioned, all
Face to Face.
But they're skate punk bands. Yeah, they're all skate punk bands though.
Well, that's it. Fat Wreck kind of took that skate punk crossover and sort of cemented that SoCal sound, didn't they? They kind of like MXPX and Good Charlotte and that. They kind of owe it to that. And it's like a sweeter version of like Bad Religion and TSOL. It's like a less earnest, angsty, or not angsty, but a less earnest kind of politically charged version of that. And that plays a huge part in the early history of what became commercialized pop punk.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing they did as well was Jawbreaker, obviously, which we already talked about. It kind of set the scene for bands like Get Up Kids and Jimmy Eat World and things like that.
We will talk about
which we kind of debated. I mean, can I just get a show of hands here, right? Does everybody know Jimmy Eat World? So who thinks Jimmy Eat World are pop punk? Put your hand up if you think they're pop punk.
See, fuck you.
So we had a debate before.
I mean, that's half the room. Yeah. That's half the room. Yeah. I personally don't think Jimmy Eat World. I don't either. I think they're adjacent. I think the thing with Jimmy Eat World is they sort of became retrospectively pop punk.
Well, I think maybe like a few of their tracks are very pop punk, and then a few, and then they definitely go way more emo.
A bit like
other stuff.
A bit like Get Up Kids. I think they started as like one of these pure Jade Tree kind of emo bands, and then gravitated towards more simplistic, catchy songs.
Save the Day as well. a good example.
Yeah, similar, and they were close to pop punk at points, but I think the fact, so their sound, Jimmy Eat World and all that, sort of led on to bands like All American Rejects, and I think as a result, it sounds more pop punk in retrospect than it actually was at the time. I think it's more of a retrospective thing. I don't think it actually sounds much like the pop punk bands, and certainly contemporaneously, they didn't sound like that. They didn't sound like the pop punk acts that were happening at that moment, in my opinion.
Yeah,
which is why I threw the
when you
voice
look back and like on pretty much every like pop punk playlist or compilation or something, they always have a Jimmy Eat World song on. But yeah, they're not necessarily a pop punk band. They just wrote some really good pop punk songs.
I mean, there's bands that they're associated with, I don't want to jump the gun here, but there's bands that were associated with that sound at that time who are also probably pop punk bands but are categorised as being emo bands too, you know, like Taking Back Sunday and My Chemical Romance, bands like that who are clearly like, I'm Not Okay is a fucking pop punk song. A lot of their songs are pop punk songs, but they would never be considered that. Anyway, Dave.
Anyway, right, so for the next 5 or 6 years, I want to talk about the golden era of...
Wait, you were talking about for 5 or 6 years?
Oh, well. I'm catching up on all the stuff I haven't said yet.
What year are you
So I'm going from 1998 for the next...
Oh, 98, okay.
Yeah.
You're starting 98?
Yeah.
Oh, there's still some ground to cover. Yes! Yes!
Have you still got some stuff to talk about?
There's definitely stuff we've not talked about, we should be spoken about at this particular
I'll go for it.
Better get our shit together then.
Yeah, man. So we're thinking that, like, after all the sort of skate punk influence started to really feed into all these kind of pop punk bands, then it gets big in the mid-90s. So one of the classic things about Smash is the fact that a lot of people attribute the fact that the Offspring Smash became so big because it was released literally a week after Kurt Cobain died.
It came out the day that his body was found.
Yeah, and
16 million record sales for Smash, the third Offspring album.
Yeah, and it's one of the most popular independent records
of all time. It's the biggest selling independent record of all time.
And the record that followed afterwards is really interesting as well. But around the Offspring, we also have things like Green Day, Dookie.
Yeah, no, we can't just say that in half a sentence.
We're not. We're going to talk about that. I know you want to talk about that. Dookie is probably a lot more influential in a lot of pop punk bands now than the Offspring ever were. The Offspring were always showed a lot closer to being hard rock, and they certainly do become that as their career goes on.
I don't really agree with that, but okay.
Oh, it's going to be tasty later on. And yeah, NoFX, Punk in Public, huge influence.
It sold 1 million records for NoFX album. It's massive, yeah.
And Out Come the Wolves. So I mean, and that came out in 1995. So if you think about Epitaph in 94, 95, like Brett Gurewitz could buy so much fucking heroin. The amount of records he sold with Offspring and Rancid.
Rolling in heroin.
Yeah. But yeah, in that kind of key era is not just as there are bands like that, but there's also a lot of underground bands who take the pop punk thing and then add it to kind of more hardcore stuff, which is the pop punk that I like, which we're not going to speak very much about, which is bands like Kid Dynamite. Those bands are hugely influential in bands like Newfound Glory and stuff like that, because they were hardcore, and those guys were hardcore kids when they were growing up, and they were like the cool hardcore kids, really liked those pop punk bands because of that, you know. So yeah, 94, 95 is when it starts to grow big.
I mean, 94 is the commercial apex of it, right? I mean, totally, even though there were bigger bands, or maybe, you know, Blink-182 and stuff came after, the record sales in 94, 95 were astronomical. You know, like all-time biggest selling record type sales,
And that's kind of, it does come from Rancid, Offspring, Green Day and NoFX, who were like the 4 key big pop punk bands that released records in those 2 years, and it just forever changed the landscape of music as we know it, because it then starts to seep into pop generally, pop music generally, which I think is probably a good time to talk about.
When do we get to talk about Dookie?
Dookie? Oh, go on. I know you're dying to talk about it.
Because I mean, I don't think
it's a great album. Like, why not?
Dookie is the Hiroshima of the Second World War in pop punk. It's
talk about fucking scatological humour, mate. It's called Dookie.
I mean, Green Day, obviously, as I mentioned, had kind of been a band since effectively '86 as Sweet Children. The first record, 1039 Smoothed Out Slappy Hours, is a combination of 2 EPs. Is that right? Really good, but dead primitive, and has a lot more in common with some of those kind of proto acts. Kerplunk is like the first signs of this like indie punk, sort of like commercial punk. It's really structure based punk rock. It's a pretty remarkable record actually, and I was going to nominate it for my choice. Anything by Green Day just probably by default shouldn't apply. I mean, it's just pretty ridiculous how enormous that band is. But Kerplunk's really good, and it did only sell 50,000 records when it came out. It was the Longview single that actually was first picked up, though, from Dookie by MTV. I think partly because of the content of the lyrics and the style of it, as well as the bass line, that sort of way of playing punk rock was just so unexpected, I think, for audiences, that it got into heavy rotation on MTV2 purely in the back of requests. And then, you know, by now Dookie sold 20 million, well over 20 million copies. You know, it had Grammys, it had hit singles all over it. I think one of the interesting things about Dookie that doesn't get talked about, and it's interesting in the context of the fact that we're being quite comprehensive here, that the cover art of Dookie is not only quite iconic, but it's quite significant in that, first of all, the album landed in the music scene like an atomic bomb. It really did. It just completely obliterated so much stuff around it, much like Nevermind, but maybe even slightly more, because it had an even bigger reach, because it was so much more light-hearted and so much more kind of whimsical, in a way that Nirvana, a bit like Radiohead, you know, so still alienate people by being a bit morose and a bit kind of preachy. That crazy busy cover of Dookie really kind of nicely represents the huge mix and variety of elements and influences, from the scatology to the aggro, the self-awareness, the humour, the angst. These are all things that went into making this really odd, jumbled up sound that Green Day represented. I mean, it's taken us up until this point to even try and vaguely summarise it. There was so many things going on in terms of the pop punk sound, and that cover, the busyness and silliness of that cover, I think really captures that. And I think the fact that it's drawn really embodies one of the key aspects of pop punk that would elevate it above even grunge, I think, in terms of like commercial appeal, in the sense that childish good-naturedness, the silliness, the lightheartedness, a bit like we were saying about Gen X, allowed pop punk to reach younger kids than grunge would reach. It allowed them to reach teeny boppers and even normies, you know, because around about that time you started to notice people pulling up to school in their dad's car with these tracks playing, and it was like, wow, this music's actually appealing to people that would usually only listen to completely commercial produced stuff at the time. And that, I think, obviously the ears pricked up of the industry at that point, and certainly by the turn of the century they were realising that they could synthesise that to great financial reward.
One thing I find interesting about Dookie is that you said that Kerplunk only sold 50,000 records, and that's what actually got them the major record label deal that made them produce a record like Dookie, which is still hugely influential even to this day. And it's like the same feeding frenzy that happened around new metal, right? It's like as soon as Nirvana started getting big, record labels were just like, fuck, let's just grab anything that's got guitars and make it sound as big as Nirvana. And by and large, it worked out for Green Day anyway, that's for sure. And
Yeah, well,
later for the Offspring as well.
Much like Offspring, Bad Religion, they were one of those bands that were just swept up in that feeding frenzy, because if that hadn't happened, Nirvana hadn't happened and the focus had lain elsewhere, then I can imagine that 50,000 wouldn't have been enough to get them that deal, and it wouldn't have been enough to create Dookie the way they did, and things would be very different, obviously.